I'd like to get out your Bibles and turn to Matthew 15. We're going to read that almost half the chapter in just a second. But I'm thankful to see each and every one of you here tonight. Obviously, you made the decision to be here. And that's so encouraging for me, I know, getting to see you from this way. And I know you're also being great encouragement to the people sitting around you, that you decided to come back here tonight and worship some more. It says a lot about your character. It says a lot about your heart. And I appreciate that. I know most importantly, God appreciates that and is thankful for you in that way. Obviously, many of us are having to handle several different challenges in our life right now. I think Devin's prayer attested to that. Many of us may have lost loved ones recently, or maybe there's just things going on that we can't describe, but it's just we're having a difficult time. And especially, if you go and you watch the news every night, you're going to have, kind of a difficult time because just things are bad in general, and there's nothing really to be happy about in that regard. But something to think about and something to meditate on to balance that out is all the great things that are going on here at this congregation here. There's a lot of great things going on for Gardendale Church of Christ. We're growing. Things are going extremely well. I would say that this is a time of, it's like peacetime. Like everyone's generally kind of happy with each other, and we're all working hard, trying to serve and glorify God together, and that's great, and it's something to think about. So, because it's peacetime, because there's really no major battles being fought right now, or major challenges publicly as a group, as a church family, I thought it would be the perfect time to talk about this. And what it is usually, this is the word that we throw around in wartime, or when things are bad. Pharisees. Pharisees. And when things are bad, usually when there's divisions among us and people are worried about weird things, they usually think, that other group over there, they're Pharisees because they disagree with me. That group over there, they're Pharisees because they disagree with me. So we use the Pharisees, basically the people in the 60s use the word communist. They're communists. Well, that's red. Well, now we as Christians, we call them Pharisees. And some of us, the only thing we know about Pharisees is that Jesus didn't like them. And that's really the only thing we could say about them. But hopefully after tonight, you'll be able to say a lot more about the Pharisees. So I want to look at this, and let's read together Matthew 15. I'm going to read through verse 20, actually. We'll see a conflict between the Pharisees and Jesus Christ and his disciples. Verse 1 of chapter 15. Then the scribes and the Pharisees who were from Jerusalem came to Jesus, saying, "Why do your disciples transgress the tradition of the elders? For they do not wash their hands when they eat bread." He answered and said to them, "Why do you also transgress the commandment of God because of your tradition? For God commanded, saying, 'Honor your father and mother, and he who curses your father or mother, let him be put to death.' But you say, 'Whoever says to his father or mother, whatever profit you might have received from me is a gift to God, then he need not honor his father and mother. Thus you have made the commandment of God of no effect by your tradition. Hypocrites! Well, did Isaiah the prophesy about you, saying, 'These people draw near to me with their mouth and honor me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. And in vain they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men.' Then he said, and he called the multitude unto himself, and he said to him, 'Hear and understand. Not what goes into a man's mouth defiles a man, but what comes out of his mouth, this defiles a man.' Then his disciples came and said to him, 'Do you know that the Pharisees were offended when they heard this saying?' But he answered and said, 'Every plant which my heavenly Father has not planted will be uprooted. Let them alone. They are the blind leaders of the blind, and if the blind leads the blind, both will fall into a ditch.' Then Peter answered and said to him, 'Explain this parable to us.' So Jesus said, 'Are you also still without understanding? Do you not yet understand that whatever enters the mouth goes into the stomach and is eliminated? But those things which proceed out of the mouth come from the heart, and they defile a man. For out of the heart process evil thoughts, murders, adulteries, fornications, thefts, false witnesses, and blasphemies. These are the things which defile a man. But to eat with unwashed hands does not defile a man.'" So basically summing up these things is that the Pharisees came. They said, "Why aren't you washing your hands before you eat?" And basically he flips it and he says, "Okay, washing my hands, that doesn't defile me. What comes out of my mouth, the things I say, that could defile me, but just washing my hands or not does not defile me. And I remember being little and reading this passage or having Mark 7 read, which is the same account, and just thinking that this was the craziest thing I've ever heard in my life. That these gangs of men would walk around and they would ask people if they were washing their hands or not before they ate. You can imagine, just being at Taco Bell, and this group of guys come in and say, "Why didn't you wash your hands before you ate? You've transgressed the tradition of the elders." And to us, that is such a foreign concept. Such a foreign concept that would be important. When we think about washing our hands, we think about cleanliness. That's what we're worried about. We go to the bathroom at Taco Bell, and it has a little sign that says, "Employees must wash their hands before returning to work." And that gives us some type of comfort. But to have these Pharisees that are going out and worried about it, not about cleanliness, but they're worried about a spiritual element in washing of hands. You've transgressed the tradition of the elders. It's such a foreign concept. So what I wanted to do this week is I wanted to look at this and kind of see where the Pharisees were coming from, worried about washing your hands. And so I just have 2 slides that basically catch us up to speed on where the Pharisees came from and why they would be worried about transgressing the traditions of the elders. Why they would be worried about that. What's difficult about that is that Nehemiah, one of the last historical books in the Bible, has nothing about Pharisees. Nothing. They didn't exist yet. But then you pick up in Matthew, and all of a sudden, the Pharisees is a major group. And we had a lot of time that cost in between Nehemiah and Matthew. So you have all these political parties that we didn't even know about. So I used some of Josephus' writings. Mr. Terry talked about him this morning, and kind of catch us up to date to combine Nehemiah to where we are here in Matthew 15. Where did the Pharisees come from? Well, it seems to me that they were born when Alexander the Great, he takes over Jerusalem. Alexander the Great comes in, he takes over Jerusalem. One of his generals, after Alexander dies, takes over Syria. We have the line of Antiochus there, he's the king, and he begins to enforce something called Hellenization. And what Hellenization basically was, when they were trying to Greekify the Jews. Make them Greek. So if we wanted to Americanize a city, we would go in, we would force them to speak English, we would force them to use our currency, we might even try to force our own religion upon them. They're trying to Greekify, Hellenize the Jews. Now there were groups of priests and high-class Jews that began to support this Hellenization process. And these people were the Sadducees. And I clicked it too early because I wanted to be, who are these people? And y'all were going to think the Pharisees. I was going to know this was the Sadducees. This was the Sadducees that supported this Hellenization process. Now, every time we talk about Sadducees, we always bring up, they did not believe in the resurrection of the dead. Yes, that's true, that's important, but this is where they were born out of. They wanted to support the Greekification, to make up that word, of the Jews. Something they would have learned from the Greeks is that the resurrection doesn't exist. So this created this party. So an opposing party grew of the lower class people to repress the Hellenization process. And these people were the Pharisees. That was kind of their beginnings. And when they became this group to try to stop this process, they created things that we see in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. For instance, the Sanhedrin, or the synagogue. These things would have come out of this time period. The Pharisees would have created the synagogue to keep intact Jewish traditions, customs, and mainly the old law. So on Saturdays, they would get together, similar to what we do for Bible class. They'd get together, they'd teach, and they'd pray. And this would encourage the stop of this Hellenization process. So by the time we see Jesus, there's things like synagogues that these Pharisees would have made up. So a little later on, the Sadducees are the priests. They're running things. They're their higher group of people. These conflicts began to arise between the Sadducees, the Pharisees, the Greeks in the area, and the Greeks in Egypt, the Ptolemy group. And there was this conflict. It looked like there was about to be war in the city of Jerusalem. But Daniel prophesied, I love this, Daniel prophesied at the end of his book that somebody would come from the west and they would resolve the situation. And I think that person was Pompey the Great. Pompey the Great, he's a Roman. He comes from the west. And when he gets there, he sieges Jerusalem to take over. The Pharisees see this as an opportunity to get back at the Sadducees. So they basically help Pompey invade Jerusalem. And Josephus says that they lowered the gates for him so he could sneak in one night and take over. But they do this expecting Pompey the Great to kill all the Sadducees, take them out of the temple, and then the Pharisees are going to replace the priests, the Levitical priests, in the temple. So now the Pharisees have control. They have control over the temple, something that the Sadducees used to control. 60 years later, Herod the Great comes to power. We know who he is. He's the one that tried to kill Jesus. When he comes to the power, the Pharisees denounce him because he murdered his family. The Pharisees are like, we can't stand for this. This is evil. This is wrong. So when the Pharisees denounce him, Herod the Great attacks the Pharisees in 4 BC. And one of the ways he does that is he removes them from the temple. My slide messed up here. He removes them from the temple, and when he removes them from the temple, he replaces them with guess who? The Sadducees. So when Jesus is born, Jesus would be maybe around 2 here. Jesus was born, the Sadducees had just been replaced. They are in the temple now, and the Pharisees are stuck back into only the synagogue, or into only the Sanhedrin, the groups of the seats that they filled there. So I wanted you to see this because this is a power struggle. That's what this is. The Pharisees and the Sadducees, I know we usually say them as one group. Well, Jesus didn't like the Pharisees and the Sadducees, but the Pharisees and the Sadducees hated each other. They didn't have anything to do with each other. They couldn't stand each other. The only thing they had in common is they had the common enemy of Jesus. That was it. So when Jesus comes 30 years later and he's teaching and he's preaching, something he's not doing that the Pharisees don't like is he is not endorsing them. He's not doing the things that they practice because Jesus is making the distinction between the traditions that the Pharisees are pushing and the law of God. He's making the distinction. The Pharisees don't like that. So the Pharisees trying to consolidate their power, they're teaching their traditions, they're teaching the law of God, and they're walking around in gangs basically trying to make sure these things are enforced. And then that's when we end up with Jesus' ministry. The Pharisees are following him around, trying to make sure these things are enforced. And Jesus is not doing it. So back to Matthew 15. We have the tradition of the washing of the hands. I'm going to go into a little bit more of the detail into this in the next slide. But you see that the washing of the hands, they come up to him, and this is the accusation. Why do you transgress the tradition of the elders? The disciples did not wash their hands before they ate, and they're saying you can't do this. The elders being the ruling leaders in the synagogue. They would be the people that sat in the seat of Moses. Jesus brings this up in another chapter in the Bible. But these would be the people that would make the traditions to make sure that Judaism was staying true to its original core. And looking at the Pharisees as a whole, I don't think they were concerned with Judaism from a spiritual nature. I think they were more concerned about Judaism in a nationalism nature. That this is what it means to be a Jew. You need to be the best Jew you can be. And not because you need to glorify God, but because you need to look like a Jew, you need to walk like a Jew, you need to be a Jew's Jew sort of thing. And so this is why they would come up with these things. Well, what Jews do is that Jews always wash their hands before they eat. And that's something that they would teach, and that's something they would walk around and make sure that was enforced. Well, evidently, Jesus is having bread with his disciples. They forget to wash their hands. Pharisees come up to him. Why do you transgress? So awful. Why do you transgress the tradition of the elders? Jesus flips it back on him in the next verse. And then Jesus responds, why do you also transgress the commandment of God because of your tradition? So you see a different level of who is prioritizing, who is seeing these things as more important than the other. The Pharisees are holding their traditions higher than God's commandment. Jesus brings it back and he says, why are you using your traditions to transgress the commandments of God? Obviously, all of us would look at this and say the commandment of God would be more important than the traditions. This is the point that Jesus is trying to make. He doesn't even reference the hand-washing issue. He's looking at it as an attitude problem as a whole. So this was the problem. He brings this up that they were guilty, the Pharisees, they were guilty of transgressing the commandments of God because they were not honoring their father and mother with another tradition that they were doing. We can go into Mark 7 and we can see another perspective of this, but Mark uses the word Corban. And he says what people are doing is that these Pharisees are going up to objects in their house or things that they possess and say, this thing right here, it is Corban. It is a gift from God. And since it's a gift, not from God, to God, a gift to God, since this is a gift to God, therefore this cow is donated to the temple because it's a gift to God. And this is on top of them already doing the tithing process that is commanded by God to do that. So they're donating extra to the temple. There's nothing wrong with donating extra to the temple, but this is something they're doing and at the same time neglecting their father and mother. So you'd have the situation, and this is what the American Standard puts it as. He says, but as you, whoever says to his father or mother, whatever I have that would help you has been given to God. So my parents are in financial despair. They need help. They need assistance. And I tell them, since I'm keeping the tradition of the elders and I've dedicated all these things as Corban, as gift to God, I can't help you because I need to meet this other tradition. And Jesus is saying, basic commandments here, honor your father and mother. That's in the 10 Commandments. And as well, if you don't honor your father and mother, you're supposed to get stoned. Yet you're worried about donating these extra things to God that God has never commanded you to do. You're holding your traditions over God's commandments. That's obviously a problem. That's the main issue here. So the main issue, Pharisees, obviously, would often choose their traditions over the commandments of God. Traditions are more important than the commandments of God in their eyes. Thought this was really interesting. So if you have any Jewish friends today or those that practice rabbinic Jewish tradition, they love the Pharisees. So it's interesting. I've had a conversation with one and I brought up the Pharisees. And I grew up in a church. I've been told the Pharisees were the worst. And that's what I've been told my whole life. And there's a lot of truth to that. If you go talk to a Jewish person that practices Judaism today of a spiritual nature and you tell them the Pharisees are the worst, they're going to get angry with you. They love the Pharisees. The majority of them love the Pharisees. And they say today that their rabbis, Jewish rabbis today, that they can chain link all the way back to the Pharisees. So if you want to become a Jewish rabbi today, you have to get an older Jewish rabbi to endorse you, to make you a rabbi. And they say that chain of endorsing the older to the younger goes all the way up to the Pharisees you read about in the New Testament. They're really proud of this. And they still do the same washing ceremony that they did back in Jesus' day, or at least close to it. And I've heard it explained to me like this, that before they eat, they've got to put their hands in the water, and they get a pitcher, and they pour it over their left hand, then they pour it over their right hand, then their left hand, then their right hand, then their left hand and their right hand 3 times. And then they have to say this blessing. Blessed art thou, Lord, King of the universe, who has sanctified us with his commandments, commanding us to wash the hands. What's the biggest problem with this blessing? God never commanded them to wash the hands. He never did he? You can read Deuteronomy, you can read Exodus, you can go through Leviticus. He never, ever said, I want you to wash your hands before you eat. I understand there might be some little kids listening. I'm not saying this is something you shouldn't do. But I'm saying that God, in the old law, never commanded anyone to wash your hands before you eat. But there's people out there today, and in the days of Jesus, that are saying it. They're saying that God commanded, but it's not true. So this is what Jesus brings up. This is the main issue. You're practicing things as commandments that aren't really commandments. And he paraphrases Isaiah 5:9. And here he says, it says Matthew 5:9. It should say Matthew 15:9. This is what Jesus says. And in vain they worship me, teaching as the doctrines the commandments of men. They've turned the commandments of men and they've turned it into doctrine. And because of this, their worship, it's in vain. Because it's not focused on me, it's not focused on God, it's worried about the traditions. It's worried about the culture, it's worried about, who's watching besides God. That's the problem with all this. This is the main issue, that they are replacing traditions for commandments. That's not lawful. That's wrong. That's sin. Let's flip it on this. Having understand that, we understand something about something else. Traditions, customs, whatever it may be, they are not the problem. They have never been the problem. And when they ask Jesus, they say, you transgress the traditions of the elders. Jesus doesn't come back and say, well, you shouldn't have traditions in the first place. That's not what he says. He goes off and he says, well, you care more about the traditions more than you care about the commandments of God. That's the issue, not traditions in itself. You cannot escape traditions. Even people that claim to be very untraditional, hey, Andrew, I'm really cool, I'm really awesome, I'm very untraditional. They even cannot escape traditions. The only thing that I learned most about traditions when I was younger was the movie Fiddler on the Roof. That's what my granddad used to say, hey, let's go watch Fiddler on the Roof. Fiddler on the Roof, the first song, if you've ever seen it, they all sing about traditions. And it's not about spiritual things, it's about this is our way of life. This is just what we do. This is what dads do. This is what moms do. This is what the kids do. Pants. If you're wearing pants right now, pants, for men to wear pants is a traditional thing. We haven't always worn pants. I don't know if God made Adam pants on the very first time he made him clothes. All I know is that there was a time when the Gaul people joined the Romans and the Romans made fun of all the men because they wore pants. But pants obviously caught on. Togas did not, thankfully. But as you can see, you cannot even change the way you dress without messing up tradition. You will always, forever, while you're on this earth, be stuck in tradition. So that's something you're just going to have to understand and handle. But Jesus even had traditions and he had customs. It says in Luke 4:16, it says, Jesus, so he came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, and as his custom was, he went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day and stood up to read. It was Jesus' custom, it was his tradition to go to the synagogue and read. That's what he did. There's another tradition here that I think you would notice in this passage. Another tradition in this passage is just the synagogue itself. The idea of getting together on the Sabbath day to study and to teach, to pray, that itself was a tradition. It was a custom of man. But Jesus, I would say, endorses the tradition because he participates in it. He's engaged in it. He actually stands up to read, and he made it his habit practice to do so. So why would God endorse a tradition? God endorses a tradition because the synagogue in the days of the Jews, it aided in the commandments of God. It didn't break the commandments of God like the Corban did with your parents. This aided the commandments of God. And what was one of the commandments that it aided? And I picked the most basic one, Deuteronomy 6:5. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength. You're going to have a really hard time loving the Lord like you should if you don't know about him. You're going to have a really hard time. And I imagine this was similar to Bible classes. I would even say this. If you don't regularly come to Bible classes, if you're not regularly studying the Bible yourself, you're going to have a really, really hard time loving the Lord like you should. Because that's how we learn about him. That's how we learn about him, and therefore that's how we love him, is because we know about him first. And of course, that's our theme this year, getting to know God, and that's going to aid in this commandment. The next verse in Deuteronomy 6 says that you should teach these things to your children. How is one way you can teach these things to your children? Well, if you're a Jew, you can take them to the synagogue every Sabbath day. And as they sit there, they'll glean from what's being taught, and you'll be able to fulfill this commandment. This tradition aided the commandments. So, it was fine on my computer at home. It was absolutely fine. But this is what this says. When traditions or customs are changed or enforced, this is the problem. Sometimes God's commandments get broken. That's what it says. So when traditions, customs are enforced, sometimes God's commandments get broken. That's the danger in all this. So if you see in congregations, and like I said, I think this is the time to talk about this, in peacetime when people are relatively happy, because when things get bad, it's like it's too late. People forget all about this. But you can see some person that wants to enforce all the traditions of things they've done their entire life, whether it be in worship or whether it be in doctrinal practices, whatever it may be. But they want to enforce the way things they've always done it. Good example is Sunday night services. I have been to 2 different congregations in the past couple of years. The congregation that I left only has Sunday morning service. Congregation here, obviously, if you didn't know, has Sunday night service. We worship again twice. So even in that situation, we know that it doesn't break God's commands whether to do twice or do once. All that really matters is that we gather on the first day of the week to break bread. That's what the commandment was given. We've been commanded to hear preaching. We've been commanded to hear singing. We've been commanded to pray. All those things fit in there. That's what we've been commanded to do. But whether we meet again is tradition. It's tradition. Now, I can tell you positives about only meeting once, and I can tell you positives of meeting twice. I can tell you negatives about both as well. But I'm not going to get into that. But you can understand where I'm coming from, that would be a tradition. Now, you have people, and that or whatever it may be, want to enforce those things. They want to enforce those things. And they treat those things as if they're commandments from God himself. And when they see people not doing those things, as in they may be a member of a congregation that doesn't meet again, then they would be upset about that. Or if a congregation decided, hey, let's just go to one service, they would be angry about that. And they would put up a bigger fight than probably be worth fighting for. In that situation, and we can put that with anything. Now let me go to the other side of the room. You also have people that aren't worried about enforcing tradition, but they're the very opposite. They want to change everything. They think this is too traditional. This is way too traditional. We're going to do poorly and evangelically. No one's going to come in here and want to be a part of us because we're just so traditional. And that's so awful. We need to constantly be changing things and moving things. And they're willing to fight the other group of the side that wants to enforce the tradition. And you have these people. They want to change. What's interesting is if you had a group that wanted to make the big changes, and for instance, they wanted to remove Sunday night service and they wanted to just have one service in the middle of the day, which is fine. But if they wanted to do that, eventually, maybe 100 years later, if they were successful with that, someone's going to have the idea, hey, can we worship on Sunday night again? And the people are going to that suggest that are going to get labeled as the people that want to make changes. They're going to be labeled as the untraditional people. That just kind of goes back to traditions. But you see, these people, they want to enforce change. The best people are the people in the middle. They just say, I want to follow the commandments of God. I don't care what way we do it. I don't care when we do it. As long as it fits the model I see here, I'm good with that. I'm good with that. The problem is that these two groups of people, they end up breaking commandments when they force change or they enforce tradition in a wrongfully way. They end up breaking God's commandments doing that. These are the commandments that they end up breaking. John 13:34. A new commandment I give to you is that you love one another. As I have loved you, that you have also loved one another. 1 Peter 4:8. Another commandment they might end up breaking. And above all things, have fervent love for one another, for love will cover a multitude of sins. Romans 12:10, be kindly affectionate to one another with brotherly love, in honor giving preference to one another. That means in honor you say that these people over here are more important than you. They're more important. You give preference to them. Another one, and maybe above all, read it out loud. 1 John 4:7, beloved, let us love one another, for love is of God. And everyone who loves is born of God and knows God. Sometimes we get so worried about the traditions, we worry about the way we do things and not the commandments of God, that these are the very commandments that we break because we become hateful to one another. We become hateful. What's funny is that both groups of these people call the other group Pharisees. Both of them are correct. Both of them correct. What's worse about it, though, is that both of these groups of people that are willing to break God's basic commandments to enforce or change tradition, both of them are guilty of the consequence of 1 John 4:7. Both of these people do not love their brethren, therefore both of these people don't know who God is. And yet they're the ones trying to enforce or change. So now that it's peacetime, when these things aren't going on, when you arise in challenges later on in your life, I want us to think about these things. And I know it's going to happen to me too. I mean, I like my traditions. I like the way I do things. But it has to have this constant reminder that I need to keep all of God's commandments. Always, no matter what, the traditions, they always come second. And when I think about traditions, I think about giving preference to one another. I remember that if I truly know who God is, I will love my brethren no matter what. Those are the things we need to remember. Those are the things that keep you from being a true Pharisee. This is what a Pharisee was, someone that didn't care about these things, that they only wanted their traditions. One final thought on this. So some people have learned to beat the system. And I have been in congregations where we've had troubles and we'd have to deal with splits and things of that nature over, the way we do things, the way we take the Lord's Supper or whatever it may be. And something that people learn to do is they think they're cheating the system. And they want something done or they want something changed. And they'll say, okay, I know I'm the only person that may want this change. And even though there's really no benefit to changing this thing or enforcing these things. And when someone says, well, we're not going to do that, we've made that decision, they say, well, you've hurt my feelings. You've hurt my feelings, therefore you're breaking these commandments, so you need to change for me. The Pharisees pulled a similar stunt. Jesus offended them. And the disciples bring this up. Matthew 15:12. Then his disciples came and said to him, do you know that the Pharisees were offended? You offended them. When they heard this saying, this is Jesus' response to that, but he answered and said, every plant which my heavenly Father has not planted will be uprooted. Let them alone. They are blind leaders of the blind. And if the blind leads the blind, both will fall into a ditch. And Jesus understands that they were offended, but he doesn't even comment on it. He just says, look, I was just trying to snap them out of it. They're the blind leading the blind. Obviously, God has not planted in their hearts, and eventually one day they'll be uprooted. Because they do not have God's commandments as a center focus in their life. That's the solution to all this. If you don't want to be a Pharisee, if you don't even want to be a Sadducee, keep God's commandments center focus in your life. And that's going to make all the difference. Appreciate your close attention tonight. Appreciate, of course, all of you being here. And I appreciate just getting to see you like this way and worshiping with me. Worshiping with each other. I hope we keep these things on our minds. We keep God's commandments right here. If you're ready to keep God's commandments right here, and I'll tell you one thing right now, if you understand what you need to do, if you understand the plan of salvation and you know that there's a little bit holding you back from that, you're not yet keeping God's commandments right here. They're not focused right here. And if maybe you're worried about what you're going to look like to the outside world, or maybe you're worried about the way you're going to do it in the sense of you're nervous about getting up here and having to be in front of everybody, I think you're actually worried about customs and traditions more than you're worried about what God needs you to do, what God asks you to do now. If you're ready, don't wait. Don't wait. Keep God's commandments right here, and please come forward as we stand and as we sing.
Why do you wait?